Here's a political riddle. How do you ruin your best political week? Answer: you have the ethics commissioner announce that she's concerned about an alleged conflict of interest around the pension industry. Well, that's been the story for the finance minister, Bill Morneau. It came just days after he released his rosy economic update, which included presiding over the fastest growing economy in the G7, a deficit smaller than predicted, and plowing new money into the tax-free child benefit and other programs. But after days and days of hammering from the opposition, can the minister defend the latest controversy? I sat down with Bill Morneau late last week to try to get some answers. Thanks for doing this, Minister. Good to see you.
I'm happy to be here this morning.
You've had a rough ride and some good news. Let me start with the bad news, then we could talk about the good news. The bad news is, despite the fact that you've delivered tax breaks to small businesses, despite the fact that you have the fastest growing economy in the G7, every single day you're getting hammered over your personal finances and ethics issues. Let me just start with a straight up question. Why did you wait so long to put everything in a blind trust?
You need to think about where I'm coming from, obviously. So I came into public life as someone who had some success and had to work with the ethics commissioner to make sure that I arranged my affairs in a way that could assure that I didn't have conflicts of interest. So when she made the recommendations that I should have an approach that she thought was appropriate, a conflict of interest screen, I considered those and thought they were the right recommendations. So we find ourselves this week in kind of uncharted territory. Canadians, looking and saying, is there a standard that should be, higher for a finance minister? So I would say that I reacted quite quickly. I said,
but to be fair, we're not actually looking for the standard. The standard was set by the Prime Minister when you became a minister, and your mandate letter, and I'll read it to you. This is an obligation that is not fully discharged by simply acting within the law. In your mandate letter, the standard was set by the Prime Minister. Did you fail to live up to your own government standard on this stuff?
Well, absolutely not. In fact, the standard was that all of us should live up to the highest standards of integrity. So what does that mean?
Well, you tell me. The Prime Minister had a blind trust. Maybe that was the standard.
Well, that might have been appropriate for him, but the way we work through these things is we actually have an officer of Parliament who considers in very granular detail our situation and comes up with the approach that in her estimation is the appropriate approach.
But are you lowering the standard of your own government to protect your own credibility?
I think you've got it wrong. I mean, I think that you have to consider actually the real facts. So the real facts are that the Ethics Commissioner considers my situation and comes up with recommendations that hold us to the highest standard. So using little pieces of information like an administrative error on a house that was declared 2 years ago, really that's not actually making much progress. So for me, stepping back and saying absolute assurance on that, I'm going to sell the shares that I built with my father for 25 years because the work that I'm doing now is more important than that. Even though I have a great deal of satisfaction from what I've done before, I'm much more in tune with what I'm doing now and making a difference for Canadians.
This is what you told the Ethics Commissioner. You're going to sell all the shares.
I'm going to, and I said a few more things.
Right.
So I said, I'm going to do that, and she was supportive but surprised, and then move forward and putting in place a blind trust, not something that in my situation was her recommendation, but an additional effort. And then, my conclusion was that because I've been in office for a couple of years and because I've had those shares, I said, to make absolutely sure for people, I'm going to donate any change, any difference in value from those shares from October 19th, 2015, when we came into office, until the time they're sold. So if there's not a better way to give Canadians assurance that, we're working on their behalf, that we're paying attention to their issues, I don't know it, and that's why I'm doing it.
Just a couple things, because I want to move on to a bunch, but this has been the #1 issue, because before you get, the credibility is very important. One question on this villa. People are asking, not that you forgot to declare for a couple of years, why were you holding it as a corporation? Why do you own a house through a corporation? The reason that's important is people think you're using corporate structures to lower your tax as the kind of loophole you're trying to close, but you're availing yourself of those same loopholes. And that's what people suggest is hypocrisy.
Well, people. So
well, the opposition.
Sure.
The opposition every single day in the House.
As we know, the opposition has a job to be the official opposition, and these are tactics. But you've just got to acknowledge that the asset was declared from day one.
But why was it held in a corporation? That's the key. Was it to lower your taxes?
No. So this was put in a corporation because the tax approach at the time that was suggested by the lawyers was to put it into a corporation, and that's the way in France foreigners hold those assets. So moving forward to do that was something much like a purchase and sale agreement that you might have in Canada to buy a house. And so an administrative error that has a fee attached to it, which of course I would move forward to pay, is a very small issue that I've said to my team, let's make sure we don't make these mistakes because they're important not to do in future. But
it was damaging.
Well, the important thing is that all my assets have been declared. And really, Evan, stepping back, what's really important here? What's important is that we have a way for people who've had success out of public life to get into public life.
Last question on this. Nathan Cullen, who's the ethics critic for the NDP, says there's a potential conflict that you introduced a bill to change the pensions when you became an MP and the minister. But there's something that you supported when you were a private citizen working at Morneau Chappelle. He alleges that this will benefit Morneau Chappelle because they'll get business from it, and you're still a shareholder getting dividends from Morneau Chappelle. You can't regulate an industry that you're trying to now change. Is that a conflict? And when did you recuse yourself from anything to do with the pension issue?
I don't see that as a conflict at all. As you probably know, I've been focused on pension issues for decades. I've been very involved in working in advocacy to improve pensions for Canadians. Before I got into office, that was an important issue for me. So we've been very focused on pension issues. They're obviously with the longer term goal of ensuring people can retire in dignity.
Let's get to the good news. Fastest growing economy in the G7, and you've now added money to the tax-free child benefit plan and among other measures. The deficit is $8.5 billion lower than was projected, not lower than balance, not lower than the $10 billion in the campaign, but the baseline that was originally suggested. And there's lots of debate about that. Why won't you have a plan to get back to balance as was promised in the campaign? Is it important to balance budgets?
What I think is important is to actually have balance. And so for us, balance is saying we're going to focus on what we came to office to do, which is to deal with the fact that middle-class Canadians are not getting ahead as well as they'd like to get ahead, to deal with the fact that people are challenged to be successful if they're working people. So that's what we came into office saying we were going to do, and we were going to balance that objective with the objective of always being fiscally responsible.
Are balanced budgets important? Under Bill Morneau, will Canada balance its books?
Well, let me tell you the right way to respond to that. What is absolutely critical is that we are financially responsible. And so when we look at our situation, we have, as you know, a lower debt as a function of our economy than any other G7 country. We have now a fiscal track where we can show that at the end of 5 years, that's going to go down to being the lowest level of debt as a function of our economy since 1977.
But what about a rainy day? Last question here. Rainy day. Are you doing that at the expense of the economy could slow down, NAFTA could blow up? Then what happens if it all turns around? Do you have a good rainy day fund for that?
I think the best way to answer that is by being more financially resilient, by having a better economy. Of course, we're much better prepared for any eventuality that we might see. So if your proposition is that lower growth, that somehow doing things that would take money out of the economy today would somehow be helpful for a resilient economy, then I would challenge your proposition. What I would say is that now is the right time for us to keep investing in Canadian families, continue to see positive growth, continue to have a track for our debt that's downward trending. We've got a cushion in our fiscal projections that allows us to assure that we can manage against slightly changing situations. So investing in the future, that's what confident countries do, and that's what we're doing on behalf of Canadians.
Got to leave it there. Appreciate your time today. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.